Deus Ex is a game where playstyle matters. How you play determines your experience. So in other words, letting players decide how to play, finding their fun, playing the way they wanted to become the author of their own unique experience.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Furidashi podcast. I'm Nicholas. I'm here with Lauren, who is, just beaming with anticipation and excitement today.
I am beaming with anticipation and excitement. It is currently super rainy and foggy in this wonderful world of San Francisco, and someone has to be the little ray of sunshine because of weakness.
That is true. So in our previous episodes, we dived really deeply into the question of world building. And so I'm actually going to throw things over to Lauren pretty quickly because she also sort of was the driving force behind those episodes as well. Because today we're going to talk about immersion. And the reason why is because I'm usually the one who edits the episodes. And quite a few times in the past couple of months, we've always deferred the question of what is immersion? How does it work? What do people consider immersion to be? And we're all like, yeah. So it's usually me going, yeah, I hate the concept of immersion, but we're not going to talk about that. And so today I'm going to both hate the concept of immersion and we're going to talk about it. So Lauren, lay down the parameters for our good listeners so that way they understand where we're coming from.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Nicholas, because I tend to also shy away from this topic because, quite frankly, it's a hard topic.
Yes.
And as a neurodivergent who already has to deal with hard topics in the workplace, I don't want to talk about hard topics. I want to talk about fun things. But the point of that, right, when I say this is a hard topic, right, this is a fun topic, that actually is me constructing, right, a mental picture of how I interact with the world.
Yes.
And that is, right, one of the tenets of world building, which is how does your world, right, react to the player, and how to use a developer. What are you showing within that world, whether it's set dressing, environmental storytelling, maybe it's as simple as dialogue, right? Someone going hey, did you see that every bush has a rupee? That is rule building, right? Because now you're going to destroy every single bush, right? And suddenly every bush becomes a target. Or it's just as simple as you mine a rock and you get rock or stone or iron from it, right? Yeah. That's a way of world building and mechanics. Now I'm bringing up all of these weird kind of references to kind of start us over with this topic of immersion, because it occurred to me that in order to build a very realistic is not the word, relatable, in order to build a relatable world for your player to go inside of that experience and feel like they are a part of a complete game schema, to use now an academic term.
Yeah.
We need to recognize that the purpose of really solid world building is to create an immersive experience. And for me, this is something that when Nicholas was re-editing these episodes and going, hey, Lauren, we should finally talk about immersion because you keep mentioning it. I was like, you're right. So for the purpose of this episode today, we really want to go into that mythos of immersion. What is and isn't immersion, and maybe why what we've been thinking of as immersive experiences are different for everyone. And second, I also want to kind of talk about the ways developers try to increase immersion, whether that's through mechanics, through a system, or through, right, in a very straightforward way, the storytelling, right? That's something that is very immediate. And it's because the term world building comes from, right, novels and from film in terms of building a world, right, in RPGs, we've mentioned that. And then we're going to end with what I hope is a very clearly articulated argument about why flow is immersion, but also trying to breaking down the barrier for that flow and immersion, right, are not actually two concepts, even though a lot of times in media and critics and gamers, right, will talk about this is an experience where I just experienced flow. oh, but it's not immersive. And to me, that just does not sit well with me. So, Nicholas, you and I were talking briefly before this episode about that first point,
Yep.
mythos of immersion. Do you
Yeah.
want to kind of go into that, and hopefully let's create that lovely thing we call a spectrum when we talk about immersion for our listeners today?
Okay, so it's worth noting that, like, first point, and this is something that Lauryn reminded me of, is that you can't really sort of like generalize what sort of people broadly speaking mean when they say immersion, because it definitely seems like when a game dev says immersion, they mean something different from what a critic says immersion, and they mean something different from when, like, players shouting on forums say immersion. And the reason why this is important is because when you're, or even you can think of this as like a divide, like people who are sort of on the consuming / receiving end of immersion versus people who are on like the production end of immersion. People on the production end of immersion tend to actually overemphasize systems, rule sets, and like setting mechanics up in such a way where they're like, in the past I've described one of the things that I really like about, say, grand strategy games is that it's sort of like it's like a sandbox. It's a sandbox in the sense of like you're given a set of toys and you're getting sort of this like environment in which to play. Like you're given tools and then you can do things with them. And what you choose to do with them isn't necessarily like overly predetermined by the design of the game. And that's the way actually that devs tend to look at it. But the thing is, from the perspective of a player, and I'm also, Lauryn is also a player. I'm a player, even though, these categories are also fungible because even devs are players in a certain sense. But when you're on the playing side of this, it's interesting to note how, like, what is considered to be an immersive game is where all of those systems that sort of create the immersive experience are invisible to the player. In other words, that's the ideal that they tend to be striving for, because there is this notion that you want, as a dev, you want the game to sort of simulate some kind of experience as effectively as possible. And I say simulate because it's not trying to be a real life experience, but it's trying to absorb you or engage you in such a way that, things in your life often do. And that is sort of classically how, like, the industry has and also some critics have understood the concept of immersion, which I have in the past, of course, on many occasions noted my displeasure with, for the following reasons. Really just one big reason. And in this, I should actually give a big shout out to one of our Patreon subscribers, Allison, who kind of forced me to like be more clear about this distinction. And so the way I put it in the conversation that we had was, oh, and by the way, like, you can hop on to like pay $15 a month and you can do exactly the same thing if you want. Anyway, so I presented it this way. It's like, okay, if you're playing a game like BioShock, and if you're playing a game like Dorfromantik, if you're not familiar with Dorfromantik, it's a tile-based game where you place tiles to build out like, a territory that's, some has trees, some has buildings, fields, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're very, very different games, but both can be described as immersive. Though for me personally, one is far more immersive than the other. And strangely enough, the Dorfromantik side of the equation is more immersive for me. And part of the reason for that is that whenever I personally, given my tendencies, am playing first-person games, maybe because I'm writing a book about it, I tend to have a kind of like emotional and intellectual distance from them. I'm always regarding them analytically. I'm always trying to see how they work, even though they're trying to conceal how they work from me. Whereas when I'm playing a game, or even like a tower defense game, like, Plants vs. Zombies, or my recent fave, Isle of Arrows, I can just I can zone out. Like once the game mechanics and I understand how everything works, like I can do a given like run and I can just sort of like plop things down, watch the little arrows kill the little orcs that are coming towards me and be like, oh yeah, that's cool. To me, that's more immersive. But the thing is, like, so then I had to ask myself, okay, what is that difference? And the conclusion that sort of like in conversation with Lauryn that we came to was that there are ways in which immersion actually sort of speaks to or engages with particular play styles. And if the play style is different, then the way you like create an immersive environment in game also has to be different.
Yeah, and that's, I think, like that's the breaking down of this classical definition of immersion to kind of what more I hope is more of like what a postmodern definition of immersion, I guess.
Or
Because
maybe
the
just a more like
or just
expanded
a
one.
more expanded definition, because I
Yeah.
think that like when we talk about classical definitions, what we're talking about is a definition in which the culture and community of a critical, right, kind of acclaim journalism, as
Yeah.
well as the developers themselves talked about to collectively create a definition, right? This is kind of a cultural definition.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like saying the classical definition of a novel is a book and a series of events that, like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Just so that we can all kind of like laugh about it. So you understand when I say the classical definition of immersion is that start of the spectrum of like a hyper realistic environment where all of the systems and tutorials and kind of engagement of the mechanics are invisible. And one of like the predecessors of that type of immersive game was Half-Life 2, right? But was also a lot of other right first person shooters where like things weren't introduced to you in terms of a say tutorial, right?
Yeah.
Or like a step-by-step guide, but plopped you sort of, right, in media res into an experience, kind of like the original Deus Ex, where then you were just assumed to know what to do, right?
Yeah.
And a part of that was honestly derived from hardware and engineering complications. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other part of it was these were the cutting edge of graphics at the time. Now, Half-Life 2 being much more cutting edge than, say, the original Deus Ex, but
Yeah.
only in terms of, right, I think the years between them. Okay.
Yeah.
Deus Ex being one of the first first person
It is first
3D.
person. Yeah.
Yeah, like first person 3D graphics. That's what I'm trying to say, right?
Yeah. It's complicated
Yeah.
because like the history of first person games is itself a little weird, and also like depending on who you ask, like if you like Warren Spector has a like who is the actually the creative juice behind Deus Ex, like he has his own kind of like history of immersion and where it comes from, strangely
Yeah.
in the
So
game.
no, this is
Yeah.
actually great because not to get into a tangent of first person games in general, which I know we'll do a series on because of right different secret
A
things happening.
friggin' book. The
Yes,
big book.
the big book. So we will get into that, but I want to say, like, to tie into Warren Spector as the creative juice, not the developer of that
Yeah.
experience, because
Yeah.
games are a collective
Yes,
individual.
they are. And
effort.
he's the first to acknowledge that. So worth
Yeah.
noting. Yeah.
And so he as a developer, right? When you ask a lot of game developers for this classical definition, the critics and journalists asking these questions are not asking the questions of what is immersion to an engineer. They're asking it of the story directors or the narrative writers
Yeah.
or the artists, right? The
Yeah.
concept artists. How did you try to create a realistic world for your players?
Yeah.
How did the story lend itself to the creative visionaries, right? To the people that are living in the sky. And there's nothing wrong with living in the sky, but what I'm saying is the creative visionary is going to give you a different answer, critics and journalists, than the engineer,
Yeah.
right? Or such someone who is really into the mechanics of an experience.
Yes.
And so for me, the classical definition of immersion, unfortunately, has derived from our natural tendency to tell stories as humans, which is,
Yeah.
right, how is this creating an immersive experience? Wow, look at these high-end graphics. Like, I'm a very visual human, right? All
Yeah.
humans, like, we see, we hear, everything is so immersive because we feel it's simulated. And while that classical definition does hold some merit, all right, I would like us to remember that immersion within the original Legend of Zelda, right, and immersion within Pokemon,
Yeah.
immersion within Dwarf Romance, right, all of these are immersive because they give you a world to play in, right? They
Yes.
give you the mechanics and the systems, and you buy into those.
Yeah, and the buying into the world is really sort of the key component, because you can have the immersive environment that doesn't really have very high like graphic fidelity. I mean, probably one of the most broadly popular like immersive games would be Minecraft, and the graphics in that game are really, really simple. I mean, you can mod it to be like a lot prettier and so forth, but in its original iterations, the whole point was to like throw all of the effort into like the underlying systems, particularly in the way in which it sort of like procedurally generates like chunks of the world. Like that was the fundamental thing that Minecraft did. But in order to have like the processing power in order to be able to do that on the fly, because it runs in Java, strangely enough, the actual like textures and the models for like the in-game like NPCs and the trees and the blocks and so forth, like had to be fairly simplistic in order to in order for like the underlying systems that will need a lot of processing power to be able to run. And like that game is still incredibly immersive despite that sort of lack of graphic fidelity, precisely because it gives you so many things to do. Like at any point in playing Minecraft, like even if you're sort of like engaged in like, building a house or like digging down into a mine or like finding creepers or going after endermen so you can get ender pearls, like it always has this panoply of things that you can keep doing. And it's almost like perfectly designed for someone with ADHD, because like you can do one task and then you can do another task and you can do another task and you can do another task. But that is a kind of immersion because it's catering, the game is catered in its systems, mind you, and that's the important point. You really, in fact, in many ways, people should be talking to the engineers a lot more, or at least to the systems designers, because it is at the systems level where a lot of this stuff plays out, where where to me at least, the core of immersive gameplay comes from. And the problem is that when you ask like creative directors or when you ask like, the writers, because it's the problem of like the thing that I do is the most important. And so if you're the creative director, then like the thing that you do is going to be considered the most important. And so because it's an unfortunate stereotype, but it's one that is based in truth. Like, engineers tend to be a little bit more closed off. They tend to be more like, keep their head down and do their work. It's like,
Well,
they're not,
I will say the reason why it is a stereotype as well is because, I mean, back in the, like, to give contextual history, because we have to understand that society creates these stereotypes,
yeah,
not
that's
that
true.
those individuals are actually closed off. It
Yeah.
is that society at one point it was like, oh, you're in engineering and you want to work in computers. Do you want to work for IBM, Microsoft, or like Apple? And probably not Apple, because Apple's not very good. Right? This is
Yeah, at the
way
time,
back
yeah,
in the day,
yeah,
okay?
yeah.
At one point in time. Now it's IBM who? I don't want to be
IBM
in
still
tech.
exists.
Yeah, Microsoft, which is every game studio anyway, and Apple, but does Apple have games? Question mark, which is funny. That's a different episode.
No, I thought
Because yes,
I
they
thought
do.
Embracer was every game studio
Oh,
nowadays.
uh,
They're
no, it's
trying to
still
be.
it's still they're trying to be. They're
Yeah.
actually still small, but it's do you want to
Okay.
work for Microsoft, 2K,
Yeah,
Sony,
yeah, 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 yeah.
Embracer, Square,
Exactly. Yeah,
etc. Right? So now like your options are much bigger, right? Games are more ubiquitous. But if you wanted to work in computing, people thought of it as tech jobs that you held for 20 years,
yeah,
right? Not here's a studio and you get there after 2 years and people are like, okay, where are you going next?
yeah,
And so I think that this is important because society, especially with engineering, right, has shown to like, hey, you're on the weird fringe of society. Go out and be isolated.
yeah,
Oh, engineering and code is really novel. Not a lot of people know how to do it. And in order to do it, you really do need quiet focus time.
yeah,
Go have your quiet focus time.
yeah,
Oh, this is great. You created something awesome. But also with engineering, right? They've been conditioned, or I've seen some engineers make these incredible systems. And then suddenly the designers are like, look at this cool thing that I've done with your system. But the designer gets all the credit for it because it just looks
yeah,
sexy on screen, right?
yeah,
So I think that in some ways, right, because they've been pushed to the background, it's not necessarily because they are background people. It
yeah,
is that the constructs of our production methods have either pushed them while they're at the front of the pipeline, they're also pushed into the background because no one's like, wow, your lines are commented so well.
yeah,
You're there like, wow, your code didn't let my art work, so you've got to fix that. Does that
yeah.
make sense? So just to give clarity, because I don't want
Why
anyone.
game no compile?
Yeah, why game no compile? Why no builds? Okay. Oh man, I heard some horror stories about building the other day where like
Yeah, yeah.
apparently if the CD ejected itself, you knew that the build failed. Or like that's how you knew it was successful or something, right? Way back in the day. And then if you didn't, you came back the next day and were like, shoot, the CD's still in the drive, the build
Yeah.
failed. Right. And I'm like, wow. So that's what I'm talking about. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
Like,
okay, but it's
yeah.
interesting because, and the reason why, so, Lauren and I both love our nuts and bolts people. We both love engineers. We love system design. Lauren is a systems designer, so she better love them or else that's weird. But the thing is, in many ways, like the experience that Lauren just described of sort of like, you engineer go off and write your lines of code by yourself. And like that in many ways is sort of kind of the simulacrum of the immersive experience itself. Like in many, like, because a lot of people who write code oftentimes speak of something that Lauren has already mentioned, which is this concept of flow and the idea that you need to sort of like segregate yourself from the rest of the world to get into a flow. And that can last, hours and hours and hours sometimes. And so there does seem to be an interesting correlation between these two concepts. And it's one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on the more like mechanical systems based things. So, Lauren, I know you wanted to talk about flow, so I'm not going to do too much of it myself, and I'm going to hand it back to you. So, what do you mean when you say flow?
So when I say flow, I mean I tend to simplify definitions to make them more translatable and understandable for like the average human because I am the average human. Um, and for me, when I talk about flow, I talk about the immersed, like getting completely immersed into an activity or in any activity, I guess is what I should say, whether it's like brewing coffee,
Yeah,
playing music, playing a game, right? That is so immersive to your experience and so all encompassing of your senses that you become the activity. And so what I
yeah,
mean by that is when I'm playing um like when you're playing Final Fantasy or you're reading a book, I think
yeah,
for me reading a book is going to be better because when I read a book, I am completely immersed in that story. And I think that flow for the human brain doesn't have to be something that's so highly cognitive like playing the violin or learning a new piano piece.
yeah,
Flow could be as simple as every single time you turn the page of your favorite novel, you have to keep reading. Like I'm one of the people that when I started a Harry Potter book when I was a kid, I read that the entire day until I finished it. And
yeah,
so I am a fast reader because I was so immersed in reading that my brain could not shut off
yeah,
until the reading was done. And I wasn't always like this. It wasn't until like I mean I when you because when you're learning reading as a child, right, like you get tired after a while, I guess, if
yeah,
that makes sense.
yeah.
But I got so invested in some of the stories that I started to read that I suddenly, especially with manga, like I had to keep turning the page. I'd go to Books a Million or Barnes and Noble or whatever bookstores you children now read,
I just download text into my
comiXology.com.
brain. I don't know what these things are.
Oh, okay. So in your download text chips,
Yeah.
like I just completely right. I would get so immersed that like 2 hours would go by, and that's what we did as a family. We'd go to like a bookstore and read until they were like, "You should buy something," and then we'd buy something, and then we'd get kicked out. And then the next weekend, we'd go back and read. And it's actually because, funnily enough, we lived in such rural areas where the libraries weren't as good as the bookstores. Just so that we can be clear.
Yeah.
And because that's just that's how the United States
Well, also
government
because
public
so
funded
a
library
little
programs
history of
work.
libraries for the people out there. Public libraries developed very unevenly in the U.S. and generally, the more south you get and more into what is considered the South, public libraries tend to be far worse because they were
Yes.
largely a Northeast phenomenon and then spread into the Midwest and then only like much later spread into the South.
Yeah. And so sorry that I'm like getting a bit on a long-winded tangent about what I mean by flow
You
because
were on a flow.
I
You were on a. You were in the
I
flow
wasn't
there.
flow because yeah, I was
Yeah.
flowing. I was actually in flow. I think what's really interesting though is the reason why I bring that up is that it's not just reading. For you, it could be watching a Netflix series and you binge the whole series that night. For
Yeah.
me, I would consider that flow because you have been so immersed by the storytelling, right, and the provocations of that series that you now are so invested that you feel like you cannot exit that technology, you cannot exit that experience without ripping something, right? Like it
Yeah.
feels bad to stop watching a Netflix series. It feels bad to put the book down. It feels bad to stop playing Yakuza like a dragon. Like it feels bad, right? To separate yourself from these experiences,
Yeah.
right? Or you're playing Pokemon and it's 10 hours later. And
Yeah.
I know that there's something where we also talk in the ADHD and neurodivergent community about hyperfocus. And what I don't want to do is to extrapolate hyperfocus as a cognizant of flow. Flow is different
Yeah.
than, say, using your ADHD to
Yeah.
hyperfocus.
Yes.
And so I think that for me, just already separating that out, because those of you who know me and follow me on Twitter or have worked with me recognize that there is a trait of hyperfocus. That is different than flow.
Yeah.
Because when I reach myself out of hyperfocus, it's more of like relief and like it's done and I can move on, right?
Yeah.
But when you reach yourself out of flow, you're like, I need to get back. I need to get back. I need to get back. Right. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that's the difference for me. So thank you for listening to Lauren's like tangent and which gave us the history of the library in typical, right, neurodivergent fashion. There we go. So for me, I do not like when developers say that immersion is on one side versus flow. I
Yeah.
think that flow in of itself requires immersion in order
Yeah.
to have and achieve flow.
Yeah.
But that means that depending on the play style, like Nicholas mentioned previously in this episode, that the play style determines how you achieve that flow.
Yeah.
And of that, right, those systems, right, are directly, right, how the world reacts to you. That's world building,
Yeah.
right, in a systemic way. And then the translation of that system to the world, right, and then how you engage with it is what then determines the immersion. And it's how those pieces work together
Yeah.
that does it get you quickly into flow, or does it take you a long time to get into flow? And I think
Yeah.
that time to get to flow ratio, whatever that is mathematically, is what then critics and journalists who are probably still talking to creative directors or narrative designers, right? But
Yeah.
how quickly that we as the human populace, as a gaming community, can recognize this is a slow to flow ratio versus this is a fast to flow ratio.
Yeah.
Things that are fast to flow are then like coefficient as like really high immersive engaging activities or
Yeah.
games, just because we at a glance can go, this is highly immersive.
Yeah.
And then when we get the game, because it has hyper realistic graphics, and then we notice a couple of bugs, we're like, man, I'm totally like, I'm not immersed anymore. Cyberpunk, like, what's cute? Yeah. Versus, right, when you get something like Pokemon, even when it first came out, right, Pokemon Red and Blue,
Yeah.
it was like the fast to flow ratio was like immediate, but like
Yes.
the graphics weren't there. So you were like, oh, this is incredible. Versus some people can get immersed in Civilization or can't or don't, right? And that could
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
slow to flow ratio for some people because they don't know what to expect. But then over time, realize now that I've built up my armies, I've built up my civilization, I've like been playing this game and I've invested like, tens of hours. Oh my gosh, this would be hundreds of hours. You
Yeah.
see, an MMO is traditionally what a lot of people would consider a high immersive experience, depending on how it gets there, but is a very slow to flow ratio. Like you have to get through a bunch of
Yeah,
stuff.
because a lot of MMOs can be really tedious in terms of like the core gameplay loop that they put before you. The whole idea of like, this quest where you collect these things, and then this quest where you collect these things. I want to go back to there's two things I want to talk about, one of which I'll probably leave for the Patreon episode. So sorry guys, you're just gonna have to buy. But the playstyle question. So it's interesting because this is a callback to not our very first episode, but probably our second or third episode, in which we talked about Vanderberg's player types. And Lauryn, at that time, you had mentioned that one of his frustrations was that he couldn't find a game that corresponded to, because he was using Ocean, so the neurotic type. But then we actually, I think, demonstrated pretty conclusively, no, actually, there are games that appeal to neurotics, because I'm myself neurotic, and there are games that appeal to me. And it's precisely the games that I mentioned way back at the beginning of the episode. It's those games where you sort of want to manage things, keep them in order, maintain control, constantly tinkering with little things, planning ahead, and so forth. Those games are very different from shooters where planning, I mean, you can do a bit of planning, but it's much more reactive. Like things happen and you react, things happen and you react. And so when it goes back to what Lauryn was saying about quick immersion, quick to be immersed, those tend to take the form of those more action oriented games, or more, I guess I should say, reactive games, where the flow comes from the fact that you're constantly engaged with another objective, task, enemy, however you want to characterize it. There's always another thing that you have to do, and another thing you have to do, and another thing you have to do. Whereas this other type that we're talking about, which appeals to sort of more neurotic play styles, are ones where you in order to play them most effectively, you really need to plan and to think ahead, or several turns in advance. Chess is like this as well. Chess is now at the highest levels is fundamentally dependent upon how far ahead you can think in terms of your moves, because it's I'm making this move now because this move corresponds to the plan that I have for, say, 16 moves down the road. And it's
my God. And that's why I can't play chess, because I can't think ahead. And that's not true, as I'm very good at planning milestones or planning high level feature plans. But if someone's like, hey, think ahead what you need to do on this system, I would be like, I'm going to take 5 times more energy to sort that out. I totally get it now. Because my dad tried to get me to play chess, and I was just like, I can't. I physically cannot play this game. And so I would just move pieces.
I played chess competitively when I was a kid, but I think it's so there's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. It's like, was I neurotic because I played chess, or was the like the sort of the act of like playing chess constantly making me neurotic? I don't
But I
know.
actually want to really like hone in on the whole playing chess argument here to really illustrate what Nicholas is trying to say with like the neuroticism point. With and if you haven't watched the Big Five, Jason Vanderburg's GDC talk on the types of play styles,
I will link it. I will link
and
it.
yeah, it will be linked in the description below. Please like go out. We're almost done with the episode, so finish this episode. Go cue that up on YouTube, and then go listen to it after it because it is a really fantastic talk. And I want to hone in on this neurotic point is that we, as even a society, right, the way that these personalities develop is because we as a human race have seen patterns in personalities. And we also have ascribed, right, our own society's like cultural kind of mentalities and constraints onto personalities and onto these what are then mapped into player styles.
Yep.
Because at the end of the day, neuroticism is a type of personality spectrum trait. You could say, are you or are you not neurotic?
Yep.
It could be similar to saying, are you anxious or are you not anxious? Are you a worrier or not a worrier? Are
Yep.
you a calculating person or do you not calculate? Are you impulsive?
Yep.
Right. And that, right, everyone falls along somewhere in that spectrum. No one is 100% impulsive. No one is 100% right neurotic. I'm sure people would be like 99 and I'm sure people could be 0 or 1, right?
Yeah.
But there would be some things that you think ahead on, like what do I need to eat for breakfast? And even if that thought is 30 minutes later versus 30 hours later, just so that we can illustrate what is neuroticism,
Yeah.
right? Nicholas's point on chess is really important for me because chess is also something we ascribe to people who are incredibly neurotic, right? Or people who, you know, if you think of like the geeks, right? In
Yeah.
school, they're always
Yeah.
playing chess,
Yeah.
right? The pocket protectors, and it sucks because that's and then this is an American Western. So for any of us who's listening, our listeners, or outside of America,
Yeah, because chess is cool now. Like,
yeah, because
there are
chess is
people who-
cool now,
yeah,
apparently.
Yeah.
But before it used to not be cool.
No.
But see, here's the thing, right? Is that regardless, right? It takes that persistence, that patience, that ability to think ahead. Like everybody's like sitting on a board when you could be playing sports, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the mentality. And I want to bring into that because that's a type of play style, right?
Yep.
Competitive sports, team-based sports versus a solo, right, effort are just two different play styles that we have in our culture already. Then
Yeah.
we ascribe them to games, right? Like Valorant is a very different type of experience than Civilization. I was
Yeah.
going to put some, I didn't know what to quite put into chess yet. But then I was like, it's kind of like Civ. Like you do have to think ahead with your turns like
Yes, you do.
constantly. I can't play Civ. I'm okay at Valorant, but I'm not really into team sports anyway, like that are kind of against other teams. Like,
Yeah.
So that in of it right there is like a little different.
Yeah, and so I think we want to close things out there because, like, it's we're past time now, so there's that. But also, if you want to, we're going to continue this discussion in our Patreon episode. So if you want to hear more about sort of like the history of specific games that were deemed to be immersive, why they were deemed to be immersive, and also get into more sort of the thorny theoretical questions about why that is and how it's evolved over time, we'll be discussing it there. You can sign up for $5 a month on Patreon. It's patreon.com/footydashi. And if you want to sort of like communicate with us directly about, future topics, or if you have questions that maybe you're a burgeoning game designer and you want to pick our brains, sign up for the $15 level and join our Discord. And literally we respond immediately because both you and I are constantly on Discord, basically.
Yes.
But until
with that, thank you guys. And until we see you on the Discord, have an amazing thing. Do your homework and stay safe.